Cannabis is an incredible anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. So we know about leaky gut, and we know about the tight junctures that we're supposed to have within our gut wall are opened up, and that's where the food is leaking through. Well, what cannabis does is cannabis actually helps to tighten those junctures. The endocannabinoid system is a system of receptors that are throughout our body, and there's the CB1 and the CB2 receptors, but there are probably other receptor systems. So these receptors are like any other receptors that sit on the cells of our body within various systems. So we have the endocannabinoid receptors in our brain, in our gut, in our immune system, various other places.
Hey folks, welcome back to High Intensity Health Radio. It's Mike Mutzel here. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for sharing a moment of your day with us. I'm excited to be with Laura Lagano today. She is a certified functional medicine practitioner, a dietitian, and also co-founder of the Holistic Cannabis Network, which she's going to talk a little bit more about. Laura and I met back in 2007 at the Institute for Functional Medicine's applying functional medicine in clinical practice. And so we did a breakout group together, and I was really intrigued with Laura and her work, and we stayed in touch. And today she's going to talk to us about cannabis, some of the health benefits linked with cannabis consumption, some of the science on cannabis research that's coming out. But I think, Laura, maybe let's start with an overview of the landscape. And we're talking offline about some of the stigmas linked with cannabis consumption and some of the perceptions, whether they're wrong or right, that people have about cannabis, and maybe the big picture overview. Can we start there so that it kind of sets the stage for further discussion about the biology?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Mike, for having me. I really appreciate it. Well, this has really been an interesting journey. And as David Bierman, one of our speakers, says, it has been a long, strange trip. For looking at the history of cannabis, it has just been crazy, because really cannabis has been around for centuries. I mean, it's an ancient herb. It's been around since, ancient Chinese time. So it's not new. And it's certainly not new in the toolbox, in the healing toolbox. However, about 50 to 80 years ago, there was a big change with cannabis as medicine. So it was in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, was recommended for a myriad of conditions, from menstrual cramps to inflammation to pain. And then during Harry Anslinger's time, at what would have been sort of like a combination of the FDA and the Bureau of Narcotics, he was fine with cannabis until the end of Prohibition came around. And I'm speaking about alcohol prohibition. And then he needed something else to prohibit, and that was cannabis. And, David Bierman, who was on our summit, refers to him as one of the greatest bureaucrats and racists of all times. And he was really looking to marginalize people. Then there was a second sort of political issue happening, and that had to do with pulp, the manufacturing of paper. So there was paper, as we know today, of course, is made from wood. And lo and behold, it was the Hearst family who got involved with that, because hemp is also a great source of paper. And in fact, our Declaration of Independence is written on hemp paper. And at one time, all Americans were actually required to grow hemp. So it's fascinating what has happened. And I think that if people knew a little bit more about the history of cannabis, why it was prohibited, along with its value as a healing tool, we would move away from this cannaphobia or this canna bias. Because Mike, I have to say, it's been really interesting for me since my colleague Donna Shields and I, who's also a registered dietitian nutritionist, have started on this journey to bring cannabis to the forefront. So our primary reason for doing this was because we were noticing that cannabis is being used by a lot of the so-called medical marijuana doctors as a bandage approach. And that really goes full on against what functional medicine practitioners do, right? We're all about root cause resolution. So if somebody is coming into my practice and telling me that they can't sleep, they have insomnia, well, I'm not going to recommend cannabis. I'm not going to recommend melatonin. I'm not going to recommend Ambien. Obviously, I can't because I'm a non-prescriber. What am I going to do? I'm going to ask people what's happening in your life. We're going to talk about a lot of things. What's your lifestyle? What are you eating? You know, what's happening? What are your toxic relationships? Do you have any? And maybe at some point, cannabis might be a recommendation, but it would be part of the holistic care plan. You know, so, and then the other thing that has come up with cannabis when Donna and I mention it to people is, and there is no saying what the response is going to be from anybody. Some people, and I have to say the majority of people are super supportive. Oh, this is fantastic. And then you find out, my sister used it for this, my father used it for that. You find a lot of good information. And then some people who I would have totally expected to be on board say, oh no, I can't go there. You know, people are, they're not, some people aren't as big of pioneers as they thought they'd be. But I think that's going to change, especially because of some of the people who we have on the summit, you know, Jeff Bland, you know, the father of functional medicine, you know, Sid Baker. I don't know, would we call him the grandfather of functional medicine?
Yeah, I think that.
You know, Sid he's incredible. You know, Aviva Ram, who's like the trifecta in functional medicine as a physician, as a midwife, as an herbalist. So, you know, we have a lot of great information out there.
Yeah, well, let's dive into that. But first, you hit on something that I think we should expand upon, and that's the stigma linked with cannabis consumption. You know, there definitely is this notion that it's kind of bad. It's what, you know, it's for potheads and things like that. But if we compare some of the, you know, endogenous, look at, you know, the physiology of cannabinoids in the body, there's endogenous cannabinoid receptors. There's no receptors for red wine or alcohol, you know what I mean? And the neurotoxicity linked with alcohol consumption is, you know, I think much greater than, you know, THC consumption. So let's talk about some of the kind of pros and cons and misconceptions. I mean, why should people not look down upon cannabis, and why should we really hold it in high regard in terms of its physiological effects? I mean, talk about some of the benefits of consumption.
Okay, so the first thing I want to point out, and this is a very important thing for people to consider, is that the cannabis plant as we know it today has been bred often by farmers to be very high in THC. So THC is tetrahydrocannabinol, and that is the component, the cannabinoid that gives us the psychoactive component. So what's happened is, of course, these farmers have bred that because that's what, you know, underground, what people are looking for is the high THC content for the higher psychotropic effect. The way the plant is originally given to us by nature is a much lower THC content. So the first thing to know is that cannabis is a very, very complex plant, like all plants. Plants contain a myriad of compounds. So cannabis has, you know, hundreds of compounds, many cannabinoids, and these cannabinoids produce different effects. So whereas THC has a psychotropic effect, something called CBD, cannabidiol, sort of modulates that THC effect, which is why you always want to have the cannabinoid in its full-on whole mode as a plant, meaning that that is really the appropriate way for it to be consumed. Now, when I say as a plant, that doesn't necessarily mean what a lot of people are thinking, that it has to be smoked. The plant has many formats. It can be made into a tincture as an oil or in an alcohol base, in an edible, and, you know, we can, you know, quickly go into, you know, what that means and what some conditions that's good, some not so good. And we do have a nutritionist, Muffy Montemayor, who talks about the varying formats. Also as a patch for that kind of delivery, as a topical. So there are a number of different delivery formats for those cannabinoids. So that's the first thing to consider. The plant has been really bastardized over time. And if you talk to a plantsman And in fact, this one gentleman who I spoke with was very eloquent in his speech, referred to it as an abomination, what's been done to the plant over time. 2, that there are many cannabinoids. And as you mentioned, 3, the endocannabinoid system. So the endocannabinoid system is a system of receptors that are throughout our body. And there's, you know, not so creatively named the CB1 and the CB2 receptors, but there are probably other receptor systems. In fact, they're coming up with the CB3 receptor system, and there probably will be others. So these receptors are like any other receptors that sit on the cells of our body within various systems. So we have the endocannabinoid receptors in our brain, in our gut, in our immune system, you know, various other places. Now, I'm going to just interject by saying something really, really important for people to know, because this is part of the stigma issue. Mike, do you know how many people die a year from cannabis overdose?
I've heard 0, but that could be wrong. I don't know.
That is correct.
Okay.
So the number is 0. And the reason why the number is 0 is because we do not have those receptors in our brainstem. So the brainstem is where the vegetative state, you know, breathing and heart rate is. So if you were to take in too much cannabis, you're not going to die. Maybe you're going to go to sleep. Maybe you're going to freak out, you know, depending on, in fact, what your genetic SNP is, because there's actually a SNP. As you know, there's a SNP for everything, a single nucleotide polymorphism, for cannabis to have more of a psychotic effect. So for people who say, oh no, I can't do that, I get too paranoid, well, there's a pretty good chance they have that SNP. Just like the same people who tell us, oh no, I cannot drink coffee after 3 o'clock because I can't go to sleep. They're slow coffee metabolizers, right? So same thing for cannabis. And in fact, there is a company out there, and there might be more than one, who are evaluating those SNPs. And I'm actually using that in my practice to make very specific recommendations, you know, for patients. It's super exciting.
That's really exciting, Laura. But I think the important point here is that humans, yet again, we're really good at screwing things up, whether it's our food supply or environment, and we've screwed up the marijuana plant. I mean, from what it sounds like. So if we were to back up, you know, go back to our ancestor days, you know, and look at primal humans and so forth living in other parts of the world that may grow cannabis, the CBD to THC content is much different from what we see today in America. And so that's kind of why there is a stigma, in your opinion, around it, because it's so high in THC. So it has all the psychotropic effects and affects memory and, you know, maybe motivation and things of the sort. So that's what we're saying here, is that the natural CBD content, it should be higher than the THC, but we're not seeing that in present day.
Right, that is some of it. But I also want to point out that for some conditions, a ratio of 1 to 1, and you always use CBD first, so CBD to THC. And remember, those are only 2 of the cannabinoids. It may be later on that researchers are going to point out many other cannabinoids and what ratio they should be in your cannabis as medicine. So just to give you an example, seizures. So seizures are something that I think, you know, unless you've been living under a rock, you know that cannabis has application for seizure disorders. And that, of course, was made very clear in Sanjay Gupta's 3-part series called Weed. And Sanjay Gupta did a complete 180 about cannabis, you know, and I just absolutely adore him for coming forward and saying, hey, I was wrong. I took a better look at this. I looked at the scientific literature, and I see what application it has. And what he did, he interviewed, and this is become now a very famous case with a little girl named Charlotte Fiji, who happens to be a twin. And this is very close to my heart because I have twins, and I have a daughter who had a seizure disorder, who, by the way, I'm just going to put out there, her seizures were completely ameliorated by diet. And I know that you talk a lot about the ketogenic diet. So that's just a little bit of an aside, because this was many years ago. before we had access to cannabis as medicine where we live. But nobody ever mentioned cannabis to me. Well, nobody mentioned diet to me either. That was my own profession. But back to Charlotte Fiji, what was really very interesting is that the ratio of CBD to THC for people with seizures, it really depends on the person, but most practitioners, and we have an unbelievable speaker, her name is Bonnie Goldstein. She's out in California talking about the application of cannabis as first-line therapy rather than last resort. Because if you fail 2 or 3 medications for seizure disorder, there's a chance you're going to fail every other medication. When I say medication, I'm talking about pharmaceuticals. So why then do some of these children have to go through 12 meds before somebody says, oh, let's use cannabis? And the ratio might be, you might start out with a 25-to-1 CBD to THC, but for some people, it might be a different ratio. So the key with cannabis is really, it's very, very personalized. I mean, this is taking personalized medicine to its utmost degree. And also it gives the patient the ability to titrate. And the titrating is very important because most of the time for the effects of cannabis, less is more. It sort of reminds me of makeup at one time, that, less is more. And we have a great, probably the top practitioner in that area is Dustin Sulak. He's in Maine, and he's actually also speaking on the summit. So that is another key thing to know, that less is more. It is not, bong hits, it's not dabs, it's not waxes.
Yeah.
Low dose.
That's an important point, because we always think that more is better. So it sounds like there's almost like a homeopathic or hormetic effect through which cannabinoids are affecting the body, which
Yes.
leads me to the next question. I was on an airplane ride. This is kind of random, but I wanted to bring this up. I was on an airplane ride and sat next to this guy from Texas. Incidentally, his name was Dallas, and he was working for a biotech company that made purified cannabinoids. I can't remember the name of the company.
Okay.
But anyway, he was saying that humans, he was giving me this long, diatribe on the benefits and why we should all be consuming cannabis at a low level, because humans throughout, time, he said, researchers have shown that we've been consuming cannabinoids or cannabis at very low levels daily. So he recommends that everyone, even if you don't have MS or seizures or any of these other inflammatory disorders, should be consuming cannabis on a low level just because of the health benefits that they offer. What do you think about that, Laura?
That is really interesting. And I'd love to meet Dallas and talk to him. Yeah, I can absolutely see why he says that. First of all, let's think about it. The endocannabinoid system is something that exists in all humans and all the way down to sea squirts. So this is not just in humans. Your pets have an endocannabinoid system. And that system can get upregulated not only by cannabinoids, but also by other lifestyle behaviors, as in exercise, or for babies, breastfeeding, or sex. And these are things that people don't realize. We used to say for an exercise, it was the endorphins. It's not the endorphins. It's actually your endocannabinoid system being upregulated. So that it's really interesting to know that. And for a little side note, and then I'll get back to Dallas's comment. I thought this was fascinating. Do you know that if you consume cannabinoids, so in the plant, of course, they would be called phytocannabinoids. And let's say you do vigorous exercise or you have a rapid weight loss. Because cannabinoids are lipophilic, meaning, of course, they are attracted to fat, what happens when you exercise and when you lose weight? You have lipolysis. You may then get an effect.
Right.
You may then get a cannabinoid effect, whether it's to be very relaxed or and the same effect that you would get when you were using the cannabis. So I just wanted to mention that as an aside because it is lipophilic. Now, back to the application possibly and the use of cannabis for all people. Yes, that does make sense because you're now upregulating that endocannabinoid system, that pleasure system. Well, who wouldn't want to do that, on a regular basis? Because the endocannabinoid system is involved with homeostasis. Think of it as in an adaptogenic way, the same way that adaptogenic herbs work. It regulates your system, and balances you out. So it is really the ultimate. Technically it's not an adaptogenic herb, but the ultimate as an adaptogen and for normalization and homeostasis. But I think the key would be, what is your personal level? Just the way we know as functional medicine practitioners, not everybody requires the same level of vitamin D. Not everybody, and you know what, if we just take it even out of the context of taking things in, whether it's cannabis or vitamin D, or broccoli seed extract, think about everybody and what their threshold level is for stress, right? Don't we know people who have like an insane threshold level for stress? Like, we cannot even believe how much these people handle, and yet they are cool as a cucumber. And then we meet other people who a sunny day is stressful to them. So clearly, just if we think about that, I think then people can wrap their heads around what everybody needs is so different. It's all about that personalized lifestyle medicine.
And like you mentioned, your genomics and your SNPs, right? Because, if you do get anxious, even with just a low amount of THC, maybe that wouldn't, maybe that would be counterproductive, right? Even though you're getting the benefits of the CBD, for example. And so one thing that I love all the science, and we're going to get into that in a second, folks, but I wanted to tease out on the THC side, because I don't know, we'll talk more about it. One thing that I don't like about THC personally is the effect that it has on memory. And also with meditation, I find that it kind of creates more neurological noise. Is there any upside to THC? I mean, obviously, like you mentioned, like sleep and anxiety, things like that. But before we take a deep dive into the cannabinoids, Laura, what are some of the benefits and then negatives of THC in your opinion?
Okay, so for those people, let me just answer a comment on the SNP issue. So for some people, the anxiety, yes, could be related to a SNP issue, but it also can be related to a strain issue. So there are hundreds of cannabis strains. And, of course, they have these crazy names because they were named by, cannabis farmers, Blue Dream and Durban Poison and all sorts of names like that, Bubba Kush. But those profiles do have different cannabinoid levels. But, that can change from farmer to farmer and from plant to plant and season, just the way your lycopene content in tomatoes can change. So I don't want people to think, oh, this is so complicated because it's cannabis. It's complicated because it's a plant, so let's just keep that forefront. It is a plant. So as far as the, THC, THC does have many benefits, because another thing we want to consider with the cannabinoids is the entourage effect. So actually, if we pull out the CBD out of a plant, most of the professionals who work in the cannabis community, and I mean the clinicians, the healthcare professionals, they will tell you that a CBD product made from hemp is not going to be as valuable as a CBD product extracted from the cannabis plant, because the hemp plant contains, 0.03% THC, which is virtually nothing. And the cannabis plant, depending on which plant you use, of course, will have some amount of THC in it. So the THC is still going to be valuable as part of a healing modality. Perhaps not at those super high levels, But I do want to add the important thing to know, Mike, for meditation is that if you talk to some practitioners, and we don't feature any of these on the summit, but we will be featuring them later on in podcasts and webinars, who talk about cannabis as a plant being able to bring people to a higher level. And via meditation and in religions, of course, that was very traditional for many, many religions. And I believe that David Bierman talks about it. And if I'm not mistaken, the person who I think will be your favorite talk, this is just my guess, Mike, is going to be Joe Cohen. He's a DO who specializes in gut healing. And I think he might talk about that a little in his interview. I don't remember because there were 28 interviews, but
I get it.
So I think it does depend on the strain and that THC content. So you will find that THC can modulate many effects in the body. It's definitely involved in immune function and, you know, as you had mentioned before, modulating a lot of the components that work in our system for, for immune function. So there is a very important reason for THC to be in the healing plant. Right. So, like with seizures, it's not going to work without the THC component.
Which is really important. It brings back this notion of eating whole, real food, because when you isolate and extract these things, like you just mentioned, Laura, even though the CBD content is identical, it doesn't have, like you said, I love that word entourage. And the entourage is what kind of makes up some of the stuff that we don't know the physiology entirely at this point. And there's other molecules that we maybe have not isolated and identified at this point that are having a huge pharmacologic effect. But, going back to the cannabinoids and so forth, I think this is really interesting, the supplemental low dose daily potentially, and also for different physiologic conditions, Laura. And one of the things that I read is that the cannabinoids are kind of made on demand. They're not like serotonin and dopamine and GABA where they're stored in vacuoles. The brain, they're made on demand, like post-exercise and so forth. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit. You talked about exercise, meditation. What other physiologic conditions increase or decrease our own cannabinoid production? Do we know at this point?
That's a really good question, but here's the problem. We don't know how to measure the endocannabinoid system. So we're not there quite yet to look at a person and say something is up with that person's endocannabinoid system. Yes, we have a few SNPs that we can look at now to give an idea that, as I said, SNPs that indicate that somebody might have paranoia, SNPs to indicate that certain people will be receptive to cannabis, but there's still research to be done in that area. And, I'm sure you know that much of the research has been done outside of the US because, cannabis is federally illegal in the US. So we only have one site producing cannabis and growing it, and that is in Mississippi. And most of the research has been done overseas, particularly in Israel, where the endocannabinoid system was discovered, the THC was discovered, and many of the issues surrounding cannabis, were brought to light, there.
Interesting. When I first discovered the cannabinoid system from a research standpoint is from Patrice Canny in the Belgium, Brussels area, I believe. And he has done a lot of research on bacterial endotoxin, which, as many of our listeners know, is this pro-inflammatory bacterial particulate. And what he noticed is that the endocannabinoid system helps to neutralize bacterial endotoxin. So we need a high fat, high carbohydrate meal. You have intestinal permeability, endotoxin comes through, and there's some feedback there and some anti-inflammatory properties, which got me immediately excited. So let's talk about the anti-inflammatory and immune modulatory effects, Laura, a little bit if you could, because it seems to me when I go into PubMed and type in CBD and cannabinoids and so forth, a lot of research, I should say, comes up about how cannabinoids affect the immune system. So any pearls or highlights or take-home messages that we should know about that?
probably one of the most important things to know is that at the same time, the government has has scheduled cannabis as a Schedule I drug, which means it has no benefit, but the states are we have half the country is regulated cannabis for medical marijuana use. So the federal government says no medical value. Well, do you know that the federal government actually has a patent on cannabis?
Wow, shocking.
Yeah, as an antioxidant. Cannabis is an incredible anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. And we do see that it upregulates. And in fact, you're absolutely, let's take leaky gut, for example. So we know about leaky gut, and we know about that the tight junctures that we're supposed to have within our gut wall are opened up, and that's where the food is leaking through. So I think most of your listeners know about leaky gut. Well, what cannabis does is cannabis actually helps to tighten those junctures. I'm thinking, and I'm wondering if anybody is doing research with cannabis and zonulin, because that would be really fascinating. But we are in, I think once we deschedule cannabis, and I do think that is going to happen in our lifetime. It will have to happen because there's too many states that have regulated cannabis for medical use, and now we have, 4 states plus DC with recreational use, so which we like to refer to as adult use. So that's only a matter of time, before that happens.
Fascinating. So when you drink alcohol, you actually cause intestinal permeability, but if you smoke pot, it might repair that? Is that what we're saying there, Laura?
Okay, well, I'm not recommending that, but yes.
Off-label use.
And here, that's another thing I want to point out, alcohol versus cannabis. Do you remember the campaign, Just Say No? And, if you smoked a joint, you were going to be a heroin addict the next day. Well, obviously, we know that there's very few people who believe that anymore. Cannabis is actually being used as an exit drug from addiction to alcohol, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, an exit drug.
Really interesting. Yeah, it's so funny how these paradigms and trends are being reversed all the time, from pro-vaccination to low-fat diets and even medication. I mean, it's really interesting how we always come full circle back to nature. And so that's why I liked how we started this podcast off to, talk about, the use and low dose consumption of cannabis for a very long period of time, which is really interesting. So it's an antioxidant. We know it affects the immune system. You mentioned some benefits with your daughter in seizures, I believe, and there's some research there and so forth. And you talked about the ketogenic diet, which had me thinking about mitochondria, and if there's an effect or some sort of, collaboration between the endogenous cannabinoid system and mitochondrial function and cellular, energetics. Do you know any research there? It just kind of popped up, and I wanted to ask you about that.
That is a really, really interesting question. Certainly, there is an effect going on with mitochondrial health because, for seizure disorders, certainly. But I would like to point out with seizure disorders, that, of course, has a lot to do with the electrical transmission and what's going on with synapses. Because by the same token, for people who have various issues related to, I don't even know what these are called, but and anybody who's having a lot of burping and a lot of gut health issues, cannabis actually helps to calm that down. It's a very, very effective calmative. So it's working on seizures in a number of different ways. But as far as mitochondrial health, absolutely. There is research going on with cannabis in relationship to mitochondrial disorders, because let's just look at cannabis with MS, cannabis with ALS. Those are mitochondrial disorders, and we do see, great impact in those areas. But one of the issues that we have, and I do want to mention this, because as you pointed out, we want whole plant. Well, different states have not only decided whether or not they're going to regulate cannabis for medical use, but they've also decided what conditions they're going to be used for. So in a state, for instance, like California, where it's up to the discretion of the practitioner what to recommend cannabis for, in most states, there's a list. And the list is, of course, there's no mitochondrial disorder, as a whole listed on the list. There's no autism listed on the qualifying conditions. Take it a step further, some states have also decided what format you can have cannabis in it. So my, birth state of New York decided no smoked cannabis. Well, that's a big problem, because then there's no entourage effect, because at that point, if once you are taking that flower, you're taking that plant and making it into something else, well, then we have to worry about how is it extracted? That's an important question. We don't want a butane extraction. And some people are questioning CO2 extraction. And what else is going in there? There was a talk that I went to recently where a researcher was presenting some findings about cannabis extraction. And he had done a cold water extraction. And yet the lab was showing high levels of various alcohol components. And he said, and butane, he said, there's no way that can be happening. You know what it was? It was the residue from cleaning the equipment.
Oh my goodness.
So, the extraction, you have to really be careful about what you're buying and what's, what extraction methods are being used. So, and then of course, how the plant is grown. Like with any plant, is it grown truly organically? Clearly, there's no USDA seal for organic cannabis. But how is that cannabis being grown? What type of pesticides and herbicides are being used? That's very important.
Very important point. So if someone, Laura, I guess to summarize what you were saying right there, if someone wanted to dabble perhaps in, low dose cannabinoid consumption for their personal benefits to optimize performance, reduce inflammation, affect the immune system, and so forth, you would be more inclined to suggest smoking perhaps, as opposed to some of the oral versions due to the potential residual toxins in there. And then if that is the case, is there a general strain or series of strains? I know you said there's different subtypes and they vary upon the farmer. Which one is safest, for people as general use?
Okay, so I think that all formats can be valuable. It really depends on the patient and depends on the condition. So, with smoking, you get, whether it's, and most practitioners would recommend vaporizing rather than actually rolling a joint or doing a bong hit. They really would recommend vaporizing, because that is going to be, it's not going to be quite as potent and just going to be a better way to take in the cannabis for medicinal uses. So when for smoked cannabis, your blood level goes up immediately, because it hits those lungs, and within 3 seconds or to a minute, your blood level is going to have the cannabinoids will be available for effect. Whereas, let's say if we look at an edible, which is a cannabis-infused food, or some people refer to as medibles. And, I would like to mention, and this is a big thing for Donna and I as nutritionists, most of the edibles out there are complete junk foods.
Yeah.
So it's a real problem. If we're trying to use cannabis for cancer, whether it's for to affect cancer symptomology from chemo, or new studies coming out for tumor reduction, obviously the last thing we want is sugar in our diet, because as we all know, cancer cells love sugar. So, you have to look at what the format of the edibles, but there are a couple of companies out there that have some fantastic edibles. In fact, there is somebody who has celiac, so she has a fantastic line of gluten-free, low to no sugar edibles of really good food. So there are some manufacturers out there doing this, but an edible is going to take anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours. So somebody who is rather big and has a high percentage of body fat is probably going to take longer for that edible to take effect than a small, thinner, lower body fat person. And, there was a famous thing that happened, it's now referred to as the Maureen Dowd effect, where a New York Times columnist apparently went out to Colorado, had an edible. Clearly, she did not know what she was doing, did not eat the right thing or ate too much of it or whatever, and she had a very bad effect and wrote about it in the New York Times. Well, clearly she was eating the wrong thing or too much, etc. The motto is, for edibles, go low and start slow. So you really have to, moderate. But edibles for certain people can be very good because you want that effect to come on more slowly. So for instance, Debbie Malka, who is a physician and a PhD, also out in California, works a lot with elderly people. And for elderly people who are using cannabis for sleep and also to modulate, inflammation and stress, but particularly, for sleep, they're taking an edible that is like a chocolate that melts in the mouth for a very, very slow, uptake. And that can be a great format. Children, for instance, with seizures, they're really using oils because those oils can be titrated. You really have to know, though, where your oil is coming from. So I don't want to say that all oils are bad. On the contrary, there's many good manufacturers out there. You just have to know and ask, what is the extraction methods being used? How is this grown? Are these grown with pesticides? So these are the same questions, Mike, that we ask about food. And, the thing that was happening when I was interviewing people for the summit, almost every talk, I had an analogy. I had a food analogy and I had a nutrition analogy because it's a plant. So, you're clearly asking a lot of the same questions. And I think that if people start thinking of it as a plant rather than as a drug and rather than as, a Schedule I drug, you can start to see how, we use, what do we say all the time? Food is medicine? Well, so cannabis is medicine. You'll start to open up your mind and see how it can really help people and really, really change lives.
Beautifully said there, Laura. Now, I know that was a two-part question, but any strains in particular? I know there's like sativa, and I can't remember the other one. Like, what strains have you particularly excited as a functional medicine practitioner, dietitian, and so forth for, calming, helping people sleep, and down-regulating the inflammatory response? Do you have a couple offhand that you could talk about?
Well, of course, there's sativa and indica, and sativa is the more calming strain, and indica is the more uplifting strain. So those are just two categories. So of course you would imagine that if you wanted to stay awake, you wouldn't be using sativa, and if you wanted to go to sleep, you wouldn't be using indica. But as far as the specific strains, that is again very individual, for people, and we tend to look a lot at that ratio. So the strain for, let's say, seizure disorder typically would be a strain that is higher in CBD and lower in THC. So we're talking about, maybe for starting like 25 CBD to 1 THC for patients, and then titrating to perhaps a lower CBD content, looking for that effect, until the seizures would be lessened and ultimately ameliorated. Then for something like ADHD, for instance, Now, ADHD is a whole nother ball game, and for some people, you might try a CBD derived from cannabis. So in that case, you would have to get that oil tested to see how much THC is in there, but it would be extremely low, but would still be in there for the entourage effect. There are patients who swear by a strain called Durban Poison for ADD. Now, Durban Poison has a much higher THC content, so the amount that's used is going to be super, super low. So just because the strain has a high THC content doesn't mean that you're always going to get high, because you're going to use much less. You're not going to be, this is not the same as adult use or recreational use. So you would be consuming a much, much lower quantity. So we have to, really, keep that in mind.
So Laura, these are all really important topics that I think you'll be covering in the summit. So maybe we can finish off there. So we talked about seizures and ADD and ADHD. What other disorders? I mean, you kind of hit on autism. Any other kind of key points for people listening right now to see if they wanted to attend the summit? Can you kind of give us a little bit of an overview of some of the specifics you're going to dive into?
Sure. So we'll be talking about the 3 most common reasons for cannabis use. And what people should keep in mind, that many people who use cannabis recreationally or for adult use are actually medicating. They're self-medicating. They tend to over-medicate, but they are self-medicating. And the 3 most common reasons are stress, and we'll put stress under with anxiety and mood disorders, pain, and insomnia. And those are actually the 3 most common reasons for recommendation by practitioners. And I want you to underscore the term recommendation. There's no such thing as prescribing cannabis. There's no written prescription. It's a recommendation that you get from your practitioner. We'll be talking, of course, about gut healing. I think that's so exciting, for me, and I know for you as functional medicine, followers. It's really fantastic to see how cannabis can be a part of the holistic healing plan for gut health. We also, cancer, obviously, is a big talk. Seizures, as you mentioned. We have a lot about autism because, of course, we have the ultimate Sid Baker talking a little bit about what he feels about cannabis and autism. We have a physician, Christian Bogner, speaking about that, who does have a son with autism, and also 2 women who started an advocacy group with a great name, MAMA, Mothers Advocating Medical Marijuana for Autism. So they will be talking about what they've been doing in their advocacy. We have another advocacy group called Health MJ, and they're talking about cannabis for application in cancer. David Bierman, who I think I mentioned about the history of cannabis, which is key. We have George Blackenbaker speaking about hemp. So we don't want to leave out hemp when we talk about, cannabis. Another important topic is testing. So we do have a speaker from Steep Hill Labs talking about testing. Is your cannabis safe to consume? What are some of the questions that you need to ask? Let's see, who else? Oh, Eric Goldman, who I know you know, who is the editor of Holistic Primary Care, talking about the convergence of cannabis and holistic health. Jeff Bland, as I mentioned, talking about cannabis in the functional medicine toolbox. Aviva Ram actually kicks off the whole summit. And for anybody who knows who Aviva Ram is, she is what I consider to be the trifecta for pretty much anything, but particularly in the cannabis world, because she was a midwife and an herbalist before she was a functional medicine practitioner. So to me, she is just the perfect person to kick it off. Cannabis for pets.
Interesting.
CBD is really used for pets. We have a couple of patients speaking about their experience with cannabis. Dennis Hill refers to himself as a cancer thriver, not a cancer survivor, and I love that he says that. Sayer G, who's the founder of Green Med Info, who's big on health freedom, and he talks about how it's a plant. This really affects he has a very Jeffersonian interview about how, prohibiting cannabis, which is a plant, really violates our health freedom. Chris Killam is an ethnobotanist. Martin Lee, this is a great talk. So Martin Lee runs Project CBD, and he's talking about the Tao of healing. Debbie Malka, I think I mentioned. Martha Montemayor is talking about the formats. Regina Nelson, she is really, really an incredible person and speaker. She runs something called the Cannabis Patient Network and the ECS Therapy Center. So ECS meaning the Endocannabinoid System Therapy Center. Patrick Rea will be talking about, he's from Canopy Boulder. So he's not a healthcare professional. He's not involved in the health space at all, really, other than he helps cannabis upstarts. So he's talking about innovation in cannabis fields. Amanda Ryman from the Drug Policy Alignments. Oh, and one that I think you'll really like, Rob Streisfield is an ND, and he's the person who's talking about mood disorders. So it's really a very well-rounded, I think, lineup. And we could probably have 25 more people and still not cover all the topics, which is why we're going to be doing training later on.
That sounds fantastic, Laura. Well, if folks want to tune into that, you can go to highintensityhealth.com/cannabis. You can learn more about that. I think that's going to be an amazing summit, Laura. I commend you for putting that together. I know firsthand how time-consuming and challenging, and there's a lot of gratitude involved, and it's very rewarding putting on a summit, but it's a lot of work. So thanks for putting that together and sharing that with our audience. Now, a couple of final questions, if you have the time. We want to know, Laura, a little bit more about you. That's the purpose of kind of ending our interviews this way. If there was one herb, nutrient, botanical, whole food, or plant that you just couldn't live without, what would that be and why?
Well, I'm not going to say cannabis, Mike. That would just be too obvious. Yeah. So unless you want me to say cannabis.
Whatever comes to mind. That's fine.
Well, of course, I think for me personally, I would say a plant that I could definitely not live without would be, I'm not going to say one plant, I'm going to say the confluence of herbs, because herbs, not only do herbs provide with what most people know about, and that is flavor to food, if in fact people know how to cook with herbs. But there's a reason why I'm picking herbs. Number one, herbs are something that you can grow yourself. Even if you don't have a backyard, you can grow them in a container. Herbs impart incredible flavor to food, and you can really change things very quickly by using a fresh herb. You can cook with them, or you can put them on food without being cooked. And the other reason why I really love herbs is because herbs are detoxifying. Herbs upregulate our detoxification system. They are, I think, the ultimate in a plant category. So,
love it.
My pick is herbs.
Yeah, I like that big picture, more global perspective instead of just picking out one, which is really awesome. So thanks for sharing that, Laura. Now let's talk about the first couple of hours of your day. You're a parent, you have a busy practice, you're running this great summit, doing a lot of research with the Holistic Cannabis Network and so forth as a co-founder. What does your morning look like? We know morning routines are really important to kind of kickstart the day in terms of productivity and motivation and health. So share with us what that looks like and how you structure your day.
For me personally?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, since starting the summit, I'm an extremely early riser because I have a ridiculous amount of work to do. So I probably get up somewhere between 4:30 and 6 o'clock. And I have to say, when I get up that early, the first thing I do is I live in a 4-floor house, so I live in a row house, so it's a very skinny house, so it's a vertical living. So I have to say that going up and down those stairs is very helpful. And I spend some time actually intentionally going up and down those stairs in the morning just to get things going, but not too much, because I think we know that if you start your day with exercise that it's a little too vigorous for anybody who has any sort of, you know, adrenal fatigue or adrenal blowout, that's not going to be the best thing to do. So it's sort of a gradual thing. So at that point, I do some stretching. I would like to say that I meditate, but that would probably be overstating it. I would like to do more meditation. So let's just say that my meditation is virtual. It's me thinking about it. And I definitely am starting my day with protein. So I'm either having a protein food, because starting your day with a carbohydrate is not a good way to start your day, or I use a protein powder, protein drink. And I find that that is a really great way to start my day. Prior to that, I probably is when I have lemon water. I also like apples. I also do apple cider vinegar in the morning. I drink a ton of water. So there's a lot of drinking going on when I first get up. So that means there's a lot of bathroom use, you know, in the morning. And I do take a number of different supplements, you know, among them adaptogenic herbs, and other you know, specific nutrients, you know, in the morning. And at that point, then I'm probably sitting down at my computer and I'll break for a walk. But unfortunately, I'm a little bit too much in front of the computer. And then, of course, I have to switch gears to work with patients. So it can be a little bit back and forth, which actually I think is better, you know, getting up and down from your desk rather than sitting all day.
Right.
And I do have 3 kids, although, you know, they're mostly away. But as I think I mentioned earlier, I do have a daughter with special needs, and she is doing extremely well, but there are things that I have to get involved with her to get her day started and make sure that she's on task throughout the day. So, you know, life as a mother.
Yeah, life is busy, but I like that. Starting out with protein and drinking a lot of water and moving are really key morning routines to help people kind of kickstart their day and digestive process and so forth. So Laura, if you were to bump shoulders with a politician, maybe it's President Barack Obama or a future president, someone from the World Health Organization, and you just had 30 seconds to share with them a health or lifestyle tip, you know, just something that you feel is so powerful, you know, you want them to know about, maybe influence policy around, what would that health or lifestyle tip be and why?
Well, the first thing I would ask is that to reform healthcare, we need to reform health insurance. So that would probably be the first thing that I would tell them, that without reforming health insurance, we cannot reform healthcare. And following that, I would probably talk about the application of food and cannabis as medicine, and how we need to look more at lifestyle and modifying lifestyle to affect change, rather than going to Band-Aid approaches like pharmaceuticals to affect change. Then if I had another 30 seconds, Mike, I would say, can you please ensure medical nutrition therapy under the nutritionist's umbrella?
Love that tip. So Laura, you shared a lot of great info with our listeners today. I think they might want to learn a little bit more about your practice. I know you teach people how to cook and they come to your kitchen and so forth. Tell us where folks can learn more about you and connect with you on the web.
Sure. Well, it's super easy. My web address is my name, Laura Lagano, Lagano, it's the last name, .com. And I work with patients, yes, in my kitchen, because I like to share food with them and have them taste things. And I also go to other people's kitchens and online.
Fantastic. Laura, really appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks for doing all that you do and helping to spread the awareness and increase the education surrounding cannabis. So if folks want to learn more about that, they can go to highintensityhealth.com/cannabis. And if you want to check out the show notes from today's show and watch the video version of this interview, you can go to highintensityhealth.com/Laura. So Laura, hope you have an awesome day, very productive, and really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's my pleasure.